If the desert decides you're alone, it doesn't ask permission. At 14,000 feet above sea level, where the American convoy cut through the endless Nevada training range, the world looked less like terrain and more like a warning written in heat and silence. Captain Olivia Carter sat in the rear seat of a rolling tactical vehicle, her posture steady, her eyes never settling on one point for too long, as if the horizon itself might change without notice. Around her, the unit moved with disciplined rhythm, radios crackling softly with routine status checks. But beneath the surface of every transmission, there was a tension no one bothered to name. The mission was labeled simple: cross-sector reconnaissance, confirm environmental stability, and return before dusk. Yet simplicity was never something the desert respected. Commander Ryan Mitchell rode in the lead vehicle, his voice occasionally breaking through the comms with clipped instructions that kept everything in motion but said nothing about uncertainty. Olivia listened more than she spoke, noting the pauses between confirmations, the way certain reports arrived slower than others, the subtle hesitation that often meant information was being filtered before it reached the field. No one questioned her presence, but no one included her either. That was the balance she had learned to operate within: visible enough to be assigned, invisible enough to be excluded. Her file had been cleared, her credentials verified, her role officially marked as support oversight, though anyone who looked too closely would realize that designation was more political than practical. The convoy passed a long stretch of dry basin where the ground cracked like old glass under the weight of the sun. Dust rose in thin waves behind the tires, dissolving quickly into the air as if the land refused to remember they had been there. It was here that the first irregularity appeared. Not an event, not an emergency, just a deviation in timing. A scheduled checkpoint confirmation did not arrive. Then another delay followed from a different unit, smaller, almost insignificant, but enough for Olivia's attention to narrow. She reached for the internal comm panel, not to issue commands, but to observe the rhythm of response. Commander Mitchell's voice came through again, this time lower, speaking to command headquarters through a secure channel. The words were not fully audible, but the structure of the conversation suggested recalibration, a shifting of priorities, a reassessment of available assets. Olivia did not interrupt. Interruption was never necessary when observation was enough. The convoy slowed slightly as the lead vehicle adjusted course, angling toward a ridge line that cut across the desert like a scar. Heat shimmered above the ground, distorting distance, making objects appear closer or farther depending on how long they were looked at. It was in this quiet distortion that Mitchell made the decision that would define the operation. There was no announcement, no dramatic warning, only a sequence of confirmed acknowledgments transmitted through the chain of command. One by one, units were reassigned, repositioned, and redirected away from the central corridor. Olivia caught the pattern before it completed itself. The convoy was thinning, not physically, not immediately, but structurally, like a system shedding parts to preserve the core. Her designation flickered briefly on the internal roster feed. A line was adjusted, then another. Support assets were being withdrawn, then escort elements, then proximity coverage. The vehicle she was in continued forward, but the network around it was dissolving. Olivia turned her head slightly toward the horizon, where the desert stretched unbroken and indifferent. She did not ask why. In her experience, the desert never answered questions anyway. It only revealed consequences. And somewhere beyond the ridge line ahead, the consequence of silence was already waiting to be recognized. The convoy continued its slow progression across the open desert, though the sense of unity that had defined it at the beginning of the mission was now replaced by something quieter and more fragmented. Captain Olivia Carter remained seated in the rear tactical vehicle, her hands resting calmly near her equipment harness, her eyes tracking every shift in movement outside the reinforced window. The communication channels that once carried a steady flow of coordination had become uneven, with longer pauses between updates and fewer confirmations arriving in real time. Commander Ryan Mitchell's voice still came through at intervals, but the tone had changed, no longer focused on execution of a shared plan, but on adjustments being made at higher levels of command that were not being fully explained to those in the field. Olivia observed without interruption, recognizing the familiar pattern of operational restructuring. where clarity was gradually replaced by compartmentalized instruction. The desert around them remained unchanged in its appearance, but the perception of it had shifted. The same horizon that once felt expansive now felt isolating, as if the distance itself had grown heavier. A new transmission came through, partially encrypted and partially relayed through secondary channels, indicating a modification in asset allocation. Olivia did not react outwardly, but she noted the sequence immediately. Units that had been operating in coordinated proximity were being reassigned to alternate corridors, leaving fewer points of contact within the original convoy structure. The lead vehicle adjusted its path again, subtly this time, angling away from the central route that had been established at the start of the mission. Dust trailed behind the tires in thin layers that quickly dissolved into the heat, erasing any clear indication of where the group had been moments earlier. Inside the vehicle, the other personnel maintained professional composure, though their conversations had become more functional than communicative, focused only on immediate tasks rather than the broader mission picture. Olivia accessed the internal mission display and observed that her classification had been updated again, now reflecting a narrower operational scope. There was no formal announcement accompanying the change, only the quiet reality of reduced integration into the convoy's remaining structure. She turned her attention briefly toward Commander Mitchell's position in the forward vehicle, visible only as a silhouette through the glare of reflected sunlight. His posture remained steady, his attention fixed forward, as though the path ahead required more focus than the configuration behind them. Another update arrived moments later, this time confirming the withdrawal of secondary support units from the outer perimeter. The convoy was no longer operating as a full formation, but as a reduced core moving through an environment that offered no assistance and no resistance, only continuity of terrain. Olivia noted the timing between each adjustment, recognizing that they were not random but coordinated with precision. Still, no explanation was provided. The silence between transmissions grew more pronounced, not as an absence of communication, but as a deliberate space where decisions were made without consultation. The desert light shifted as the sun moved slightly higher, intensifying the contrast between shadow and exposure across the ground. Olivia adjusted her position subtly, maintaining awareness of both the interior and exterior dynamics of the situation. She understood that in operations of this nature, the most significant changes were often not announced directly, but revealed through the gradual absence of expected elements. The convoy's remaining vehicles maintained forward motion, but the sense of collective purpose had begun to thin, replaced by individual awareness of isolation within the same path. Commander Mitchell finally issued a short directive through the main channel, confirming a continued advance toward the designated sector with revised support parameters. The message was concise, procedural, and offered no additional context beyond immediate instruction. Olivia acknowledged the transmission internally without verbal response, her attention already focused on the implications of the structural changes unfolding around them. The desert ahead remained unchanged, but the operational environment had clearly shifted, and within that shift, she recognized the early formation of a scenario that required patience, precision, and complete situational awareness. The desert convoy maintained its forward movement under a sky that felt increasingly distant, as if the atmosphere itself had stretched to accommodate the silence growing between the units. Captain Olivia Carter remained in the rear tactical vehicle, her posture unchanged, her attention locked on the subtle inconsistencies unfolding across the mission feed. What had begun as a standard reconnaissance operation had now evolved into something far less defined, where structure existed only in fragments and coordination depended more on assumption than confirmation. The internal communication network continued to function, but each transmission carried less cohesion than the one before it, as though the system itself was being gradually reduced to its most essential elements. Commander Ryan Mitchell's voice returned through the channel at irregular intervals, delivering instructions that were precise in wording but increasingly minimal in context. Olivia listened carefully, noting not only what was said but what was no longer included. The absence of detail had become its own form of information. Outside the vehicle, the desert stretched in uninterrupted layers of pale sand and fractured stone, broken only by distant ridgelines that appeared and disappeared in the heat distortion. The convoy's spacing had widened slightly, not through command but through necessity, as units adjusted their positions to maintain visibility under shifting operational conditions. Olivia observed the pattern without interruption, recognizing that dispersion at this scale often indicated a transition from collective movement to distributed autonomy. A new transmission arrived, partially rerouted through an alternate channel, confirming another adjustment in perimeter allocation. The wording was procedural, stating only that certain assets were being reassigned to secondary observation zones. No explanation followed. Olivia's eyes shifted briefly toward the forward vehicle where Commander Mitchell was positioned. His silhouette remained steady against the glare of the desert sun, his attention fixed forward as if the environment ahead required full concentration. There was no indication that he was aware of the gradual reduction occurring behind him, or perhaps he was aware and had already accounted for it within a larger framework not yet visible to the rest of the convoy. The internal display in Olivia's vehicle updated again, reflecting a revised operational map. The convoy's outer elements had now been fully detached from the primary formation, leaving a narrower corridor of movement stretching through the desert floor. The change was subtle in appearance but absolute in consequence, transforming what had once been a broad, interconnected structure into a streamlined but isolated path. Olivia processed the update without visible reaction, her focus shifting to the timing intervals between each adjustment. They were not random. Each reduction followed a measured sequence, suggesting prearranged conditions triggered by external validation rather than on-field judgment. The desert light intensified slightly as the sun climbed higher, casting sharper contrast across the terrain and reducing visual clarity at longer distances. Heat shimmer distorted the horizon, making distant formations appear unstable and transient. Within the convoy, communication had become increasingly task-oriented, limited to essential confirmations regarding movement and positioning. Casual exchanges had disappeared entirely, replaced by functional brevity. Olivia adjusted her internal assessment, recognizing that the mission environment was no longer operating under full-spectrum coordination, but under a controlled contraction model. This type of restructuring typically required approval from multiple command layers, yet the speed of implementation suggested prior authorization or a preloaded directive activated under specific conditions. Another message arrived through secure channels, confirming continued advancement toward the designated sector with revised support parameters. The phrasing remained consistent, maintaining procedural neutrality while offering no clarification regarding the absence of previously assigned elements. Olivia acknowledged the transmission internally, her attention already tracking the implications of sustained isolation within the convoy structure. The vehicles continued forward across the desert floor, their movement steady but increasingly independent from one another in function, if not in appearance. Commander Mitchell issued a brief update confirming that all remaining units were to maintain current trajectory and readiness posture. The instruction was simple and direct, yet it carried an underlying finality that suggested the operational framework was approaching a critical transition point. Olivia remained still, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the desert appeared to narrow into a single converging line of light and dust, understanding that whatever lay ahead would determine the true purpose of the structural changes now unfolding behind them. The convoy had entered a section of desert where the terrain began to shift subtly, transitioning from flat, open sand into a more uneven landscape of cracked earth and scattered stone formations that forced the vehicles into a narrower, more deliberate path. Captain Olivia Carter remained seated in the rear tactical vehicle, her focus steady and uninterrupted, as the operational environment continued to contract in both structure and clarity. The communication channels, once active with layered coordination, had now settled into a sparse rhythm of essential transmissions only, each one separated by longer intervals of silence. Commander Ryan Mitchell's voice returned briefly through the secure channel, issuing a continuation order that confirmed sustained movement toward the designated sector, though the absence of supporting context had now become the defining feature of all instructions received. Olivia observed this without visible reaction, her attention instead drawn to the consistency of the pattern itself rather than its content. Across the convoy, spacing between vehicles had increased further, not by command, but through accumulated adjustments made in response to prior reassignments. The formation was no longer cohesive in the traditional sense, but it still maintained directional alignment, as though guided by a shared understanding of destination rather than coordinated structure. The desert ahead appeared to narrow visually as the terrain rose slightly, creating a subtle corridor effect between two distant ridgelines that shimmered under the intense midday light. Heat distortion made the horizon unstable, causing distant features to shift and blur when observed directly for more than a few seconds. Olivia's internal display updated again, confirming that all remaining auxiliary channels had been reduced to monitoring status only. No active support nodes remained within operational proximity. The significance of this change was not stated, but it was clearly reflected in the system architecture now displayed across her interface. She noted the timing intervals between each reduction, recognizing a deliberate sequencing pattern that suggested the convoy had been operating under a conditional framework from the beginning, one that activated structural changes based on criteria not yet visible to field personnel. Commander Mitchell's voice returned once more, this time shorter and more focused, instructing the remaining units to maintain strict adherence to forward movement protocol and to avoid deviation from the established corridor. There was no mention of the removed assets, nor any reference to the altered formation. The instruction treated the current configuration as if it had always existed in its present state. Olivia acknowledged the transmission internally, her attention shifting briefly toward the forward vehicle where Mitchell remained positioned. His silhouette was steady, framed against the brightness of the desert sky, suggesting full confidence in the direction being taken, or at minimum complete acceptance of the conditions now in place. Within Olivia's vehicle, the remaining personnel maintained professional discipline, though their awareness of the reduced formation was becoming increasingly evident in their silence. Conversations had nearly disappeared entirely, replaced by short confirmations of equipment status and navigation checks. The psychological effect of isolation within movement was subtle but measurable, as each unit now operated with less external reference than before. Olivia adjusted her mental model of the situation, recognizing that the convoy was no longer functioning as a distributed network, but as a linear progression through controlled environmental exposure. The desert corridor ahead remained visually unchanged, yet its perception had shifted significantly due to the absence of external support markers. Another transmission arrived, confirming that all secondary observation assets had been fully disengaged from the mission theater. The wording remained procedural, offering no explanation beyond operational reallocation. Olivia processed the update and noted that no further structural adjustments were listed as pending. This indicated that the current configuration might represent the final operational state before reaching the designated sector. Commander Mitchell issued a final preparatory instruction, stating that all remaining units were to enter heightened awareness posture as they approached the target boundary zone. The message was concise, yet its phrasing suggested an anticipated transition point rather than a routine checkpoint. Olivia's gaze moved forward through the vehicle's reinforced window, where the desert path now appeared to converge into a tighter passage between elevated rock formations. The convoy continued its steady advance into that narrowing corridor, with each vehicle maintaining position but no longer relying on a shared framework of support, only the certainty of forward motion into an environment that had yet to reveal its full intent. The convoy had now fully entered the narrow desert corridor, where the terrain on both sides rose into uneven formations of stone and compacted earth, creating a sense of enforced direction rather than natural passage. Captain Olivia Carter remained in the rear tactical vehicle, her presence unchanged, her focus locked on the evolving structure of the mission environment as it continued to reduce itself into a simplified but increasingly isolated formation. The internal communication network was now operating at minimal capacity, with only essential routing lines remaining active. Each transmission from Commander Ryan Mitchell carried the same procedural tone, reinforcing forward movement and maintaining strict adherence to the designated corridor without introducing additional context or explanation. Olivia observed this continuity with precise attention, noting that the absence of supplementary information had now stabilized rather than increased, suggesting that the operational framework had reached a fixed state of limitation. The convoy advanced deeper into the corridor, where the desert floor became more compact, and the spacing between natural formations created a funnel-like progression toward a distant ridge line. Visibility remained clear but visually compressed, as the surrounding terrain began to reduce lateral perception and focus attention forward. Inside the vehicle, personnel maintained disciplined silence, their communication reduced to essential status confirmations and navigation acknowledgments. The earlier uncertainty had evolved into a controlled stillness, where the lack of external updates had become an accepted condition of movement. Olivia's attention remained divided between the physical environment outside and the internal system display, which now showed a fully streamlined operational map, with no auxiliary elements remaining. All secondary support structures had been fully disengaged, leaving only the primary convoy path intact. The significance of this final configuration was not stated within any transmission, yet it was clearly reflected in the simplicity of the remaining system architecture. Commander Mitchell's voice returned through the secure channel, issuing a short instruction confirming continued advance and readiness for final sector entry procedures. The phrasing remained consistent with previous directives, maintaining procedural neutrality while reinforcing the importance of maintaining formation integrity. Olivia acknowledged the instruction internally, her attention shifting briefly toward the forward vehicle where Mitchell maintained position. His silhouette remained steady against the bright desert backdrop, suggesting full commitment to the trajectory now established. As the convoy progressed, the corridor tightened further, with rock formations on both sides rising slightly higher and reducing the visible expanse of open desert beyond the immediate path. The effect created a natural channel that guided all movement forward without deviation. Heat shimmer continued to distort distant edges of the terrain, but the immediate path remained clear and stable. Olivia noted a subtle change in transmission intervals, where the spacing between updates had now increased beyond operational average, indicating that the system had transitioned from active coordination to passive oversight. This shift suggested that the convoy was now functioning under final stage movement protocol, where external input was no longer required for directional continuity. Within the vehicle, the remaining personnel maintained full focus on their assigned roles, though their awareness of the narrowing operational context was evident in their reduced communication and heightened attentiveness. Olivia adjusted her internal assessment once more, recognizing that the environment ahead was not simply a continuation of the desert corridor, but a transition into a controlled endpoint phase, where all prior structural adjustments would converge into a single operational conclusion. The convoy continued forward at steady speed, maintaining alignment through the narrowing passage as the desert ahead appeared to compress into a final, defined threshold marked only by distance and light. The convoy had now reached the deepest section of the desert corridor, where the terrain narrowed into a controlled passage shaped by natural elevation on both sides and a long, gradual incline ahead that reduced visibility to a focused line of forward movement. Captain Olivia Carter remained in the rear tactical vehicle, her posture unchanged, her attention fully aligned with the operational shift that had now stabilized into a final stage configuration. The communication network had become minimal, with only essential command channels active, and even those were spaced by extended intervals of silence that carried more weight than the transmissions themselves. Commander Ryan Mitchell's voice returned through the secure channel with a level of precision that indicated full transition into terminal movement protocol, instructing all remaining units to maintain strict forward progression and confirm readiness status upon entry into the final sector boundary. Olivia acknowledged the instruction internally without verbal response, her focus already analyzing the structural implications of the environment rather than the instruction itself. The desert corridor now felt less like terrain and more like a defined system, with every formation and contour contributing to a single directional outcome. The vehicles continued forward in steady alignment, their spacing consistent but no longer dependent on active coordination. Instead, movement was governed by the physical constraints of the corridor itself, which allowed no deviation without immediate correction. Inside the tactical vehicle, the personnel maintained complete operational silence, their attention fixed on instruments and forward visibility. The absence of communication had shifted from uncertainty to procedural acceptance, as though the environment had gradually conditioned them into reduced dependence on external input. Olivia observed the internal display, which now showed only a singular operational pathway extending forward without branching nodes or auxiliary indicators. All secondary systems had been fully disengaged, leaving a streamlined structure that reflected final stage mission conditions. The terrain ahead began to rise slightly, forming a gradual incline that funneled the convoy toward a distant threshold where light and shadow converged in a narrow band across the horizon. Heat shimmer distorted the upper edges of the rock formations, making them appear fluid and unstable when viewed from a distance, while the ground beneath remained firm and predictable. Olivia noted a change in transmission frequency, with the intervals between command updates extending beyond standard operational range, reinforcing the perception that external coordination had transitioned into passive observation mode. Commander Mitchell issued a final preparatory instruction, confirming that all remaining units were to maintain current speed and prepare for immediate stabilization upon sector entry. The phrasing remained consistent with earlier directives, yet the timing suggested that the convoy had entered a point of irreversible progression. Olivia turned her attention briefly toward the forward vehicle, where Mitchell remained positioned, his silhouette unchanged against the brightness of the desert sky. His focus appeared fully committed to the path ahead, with no indication of deviation or reassessment. The convoy continued its advance into the narrowing passage, where the corridor now felt fully enclosed by natural elevation and directional constraint. The visual field ahead compressed further, reducing the sense of lateral space and reinforcing a singular forward trajectory. Within the tactical vehicle, no one spoke, and no additional updates were transmitted. Olivia's awareness remained steady, tracking not only the physical movement of the convoy, but the complete absence of structural variation within the system supporting it. The operational environment had reached a point where all prior adjustments had resolved into a single continuous path, with no remaining branches or external inputs. The desert corridor extended forward into a final convergence zone, where the terrain appeared to level into a broad but tightly contained expanse, signaling the transition into the designated sector boundary without announcing what would occur beyond it. The convoy had now fully crossed into the final stretch of the desert corridor, where the terrain opened into a wide but tightly defined basin surrounded by elevated rock formations that formed a natural boundary around the entire operational space. Captain Olivia Carter remained in the rear tactical vehicle, her attention fixed forward as the environment transitioned from directional passage to enclosed operational zone. The communication network, which had already been reduced to minimal function, now operated under near-complete silence, with only occasional confirmation signals passing through the secure channel. Commander Ryan Mitchell's presence on the network had become increasingly infrequent, with each transmission shorter than the last and focused entirely on maintaining forward continuity rather than providing context or clarification. Olivia observed this shift with precise awareness, noting that the absence of structural communication had now reached its terminal phase. The convoy continued forward into the basin, where the ground leveled and expanded slightly, while the surrounding elevations created a sealed perimeter that limited external visibility beyond a narrow range. Heat shimmer above the desert floor created subtle distortions in distance perception, making the far edges of the terrain appear unstable and partially obscured. Inside the tactical vehicle, the personnel maintained strict operational silence, their attention divided only between instrumentation and the forward path. The absence of dialogue was no longer interpreted as uncertainty, but as procedural necessity, as though the environment itself demanded reduced communication in order to proceed. Olivia's internal display confirmed that all auxiliary systems remained inactive, with no additional support channels available and no external coordination nodes remaining within operational range. The convoy was now functioning as a fully isolated unit within a contained environment, operating solely on forward movement directives without external adjustment. Commander Mitchell issued a final transmission, confirming that all units were to maintain position integrity and prepare for sector stabilization procedures upon full entry into the designated zone. The wording was consistent with previous instructions, yet the timing and reduction of detail indicated that the operational framework had reached its final transition point. Olivia acknowledged the instruction internally, her attention already shifting toward the structure of the basin ahead, where the terrain flattened into a broad circular expanse enclosed by natural elevation on all sides. The convoy proceeded steadily into this space, with each vehicle maintaining alignment but no longer requiring active coordination due to the confined geography of the area. As they advanced deeper into the basin, the visual field expanded slightly, while simultaneously becoming more enclosed, creating a paradoxical sense of openness within a controlled perimeter. The desert floor here was smoother, with fewer disruptions in elevation, allowing for uninterrupted forward motion. Olivia noted a final update on her system display indicating that the convoy had fully entered the designated sector boundary, with all prior operational stages now complete. There were no further structural changes listed, and no additional transmissions followed the confirmation. Commander Mitchell's vehicle remained visible at the front of the formation, maintaining steady position as the convoy moved toward the center of the basin. His posture remained unchanged, focused entirely on forward alignment, as though the transition into this final zone represented the completion of a predefined sequence. The remaining units followed in precise formation, their movement steady and uninterrupted, as the desert environment around them settled into a stillness that contrasted sharply with the structured motion of the convoy. Olivia maintained continuous observation of both internal systems and external conditions, recognizing that the operational environment had now fully transitioned into its final configuration, where all prior adjustments and reductions had resolved into a single contained and self-sustaining field of movement without further external direction. The convoy came to a gradual reduction in speed as it moved into the central area of the desert basin, where the surrounding rock formations formed a complete perimeter and the terrain flattened into a wide, open interior space that felt structurally distinct from everything they had passed through earlier. Captain Olivia Carter remained seated in the rear tactical vehicle, her attention fully engaged with the shift in operational conditions that now defined the environment. The silence that had settled across all communication channels was no longer partial or procedural, but complete, as if the system itself had entered a suspended state awaiting final confirmation. The internal display within her vehicle showed no active support structures, no auxiliary networks, and no external coordination nodes. For the first time since the beginning of the mission, there was no indication of any connected operational framework beyond the immediate convoy itself. The vehicles came to a controlled halt at designated spacing points within the basin, forming a stable perimeter pattern that required no further adjustment. Dust settled slowly around them, carried by the residual heat of the desert floor, while the air above remained still and visually compressed by the surrounding elevation. Olivia observed the sudden transition from movement to stasis without immediate reaction, her focus narrowing to the timing and structure of what had just occurred. Commander Ryan Mitchell's vehicle remained positioned at the front center of the formation, but there was no further transmission following their entry into the basin. The absence of communication now carried a different quality, no longer suggestive of limitation or reduction, but of completion. After several moments of stillness, a single secure channel reactivated across the convoy network, restoring clarity to the system in a way that felt deliberate rather than gradual. The transmission did not originate as a continuation of prior instructions, but as a formal activation sequence, confirming that the convoy had entered the final evaluation phase of the operation. Olivia processed the information immediately, her internal systems recalibrating the entire mission framework within seconds. The designation that appeared on her display was no longer consistent with standard reconnaissance or field movement protocol. Instead, it indicated a controlled operational assessment environment, with all previous structural reductions reclassified as intentional parameters of isolation testing. Commander Mitchell's voice returned, no longer fragmented or procedural, but fully present across the channel with complete clarity. He confirmed that the mission had been operating under a sealed evaluation directive from the beginning, designed to assess independent command stability under conditions of progressive isolation. Olivia remained silent, absorbing the implications of the statement as the full structure of the operation recontextualized itself in real time. The convoy had not been abandoned in the traditional sense, but systematically reduced to test decision integrity under controlled constraint. Each phase of separation, each removal of support, and each narrowing of communication had been part of a predefined operational model. The desert basin itself functioned as the final assessment zone, where all remaining variables would converge into a single decision point. Olivia reviewed the sequence of events with precise clarity, recognizing that every structural adjustment had followed predictive logic rather than emergent instability. Commander Mitchell concluded the transmission by stating that command authority within the basin was now transferred to field leadership discretion, with full operational autonomy granted to determine final stabilization procedures. The implications were immediate and absolute. Within the convoy, personnel remained silent, awaiting response. Olivia's attention shifted across the internal display one final time, confirming that all external dependencies remained inactive while internal command authority indicators now showed full activation at her level. The desert basin remained unchanged in its physical form, but its function within the mission had been completely redefined. Olivia stepped into full operational awareness of the environment, understanding that the outcome of the mission was no longer dependent on external direction but on the decisions made within this contained space, where structure, clarity, and control had finally converged into a single point of responsibility. The desert basin remained completely still as the final phase of the operation settled into place, with all vehicles positioned in a wide circular formation across the flat interior floor of the enclosed terrain. Captain Olivia Carter stood outside the rear tactical vehicle for the first time since the convoy had entered the zone, her presence steady against the intense stillness of the environment. The surrounding rock formations created a natural boundary that cut off any visible horizon beyond the basin, forming a contained space where distance felt compressed and direction was no longer defined by movement, but by position. The internal systems that had governed the mission for the entire duration were now fully stabilized into a single operational framework, with no remaining external dependencies active. Commander Ryan Mitchell remained near the front of the formation, his posture unchanged, but the authority structure that had previously governed the convoy was now formally transferred into field-level execution control. Olivia reviewed the final mission protocol displayed on her internal interface, confirming that the operation had transitioned into its assessment conclusion stage, where outcomes were determined not by external command, but by on-site stabilization decisions. The silence across the basin was absolute, with no active communication channels remaining open except the central system link that now functioned purely as confirmation relay. Olivia took a measured step forward, her attention moving across the full formation of vehicles and personnel positioned within the enclosed space. Every element of the convoy was now accounted for within a single operational field, with no external influence capable of altering the current configuration. The desert wind had diminished significantly within the basin, reduced by the surrounding elevation, leaving only faint movement across the sand at ground level. Olivia recognized that the absence of environmental interference mirrored the internal structure of the mission itself, where all external variables had been systematically removed. Commander Mitchell finally activated the final channel sequence, confirming that the evaluation phase was complete and that full operational clarity had been achieved. His voice carried a neutral tone, stating that the mission outcome would be determined based on field autonomy execution and